And I'd like to first acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam people, and it's a privilege to be here. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle. My name is Leah Walker, and I am the Associate Director for the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health, and it is indeed a privilege to be here. And we're really happy to have you here, and it's really wonderful having you here today. I'd like to also just read a disclaimer for everyone here, because this topic, Indigenous People and Genomics, like all topics in the UBC Learning Circle, could be sensitive for some people. And the stories shared during the UBC Learning Circle sessions, participants might become triggered. So please ensure that you have prepared a support system for yourself in advance if you think this will happen for you. And this could be an elder, trusted mentor, family, friend, counselor, and or crisis contact number. And we have some access numbers on our UBC Learning Circle page if you need some support. I can't imagine that this would happen, but you would never know. So the people that we have here today are Jenny Morgan, and I'm going to allow her to introduce herself. She is the Director for Indigenous Health at the BC Women's Hospital and Health Center, and you've got your master's, and you're working in social work, and you're working on your doctorate.
Yes.
And you're a Gitsan woman, and you're doing this amazing work. And then I am going to introduce Patricia Birch, who is presenting with her, and you are a co-lead on this project. And a clinical associate professor of medical genetics at UBC, researcher, manager, educator,
mother,
nurse, all those things. And very interested in improving access, equity, quality of family-centered clinical care. And that includes genomics. So I'm really excited about hearing about this. So for everyone here, if you have a question, please, I really hope that you engage in this dialogue. I think this is quite an important dialogue. So please feel free to chat in the space here. What's going to happen is I'm going to turn it over to Jenny and Patricia, and they are going to present their work. There might be some opportunity for questions throughout, and I will facilitate those. They're also going to show a video, and then they're hoping to invite a conversation around this topic, because it can be quite an intense topic, and there's a real need for this kind of work in our communities to be done in a respectful and good way. So I'm excited about hearing about that. So over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So as Leah said, we want to acknowledge the traditional ancestral territories of the Coast Salish First Nations, which we're carrying out this work on, and we're very appreciative. We're just going to be having the PowerPoint slides on, so we're just waiting for the slide to come up where we have the members of the team. So as Leah mentioned, my name is Jenny Morgan, and I'm the Director for Indigenous Health at the BC Women's and Children's Hospital in Vancouver. And I've been in that role for a couple years now, and we have a number of services at the hospital where we do direct patient care, but at the same time we also have opportunities to partner with different departments at the hospital. So that's how I had the opportunity to meet Patricia in the work that she does at Medical Genetics. And this idea came about, which she'll talk about in the presentation, on how we became to work together on this project. And the project itself, it's a research project where I'm one of the co-leads with Patricia, and we have a couple other colleagues who are also working together with us. And I'll share a bit about the other two who I work with directly. Is Rochelle Lasser. She's the operations lead for Indigenous Health, and her background is Métis. And many of you may know Roberta Price, Elder Roberta. She is part of the project and a collaborator as well. And on the PowerPoint screen, you'll see other members of the team, and Patricia can introduce herself and also the other members.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. So I'm Patricia Birch. I was born in England. I'm a nurse and I have worked up in Baffin Island, mostly in Cape Dorset and also on the Labrador coast. So I have a little experience with working with Inuit and Naskapi Montagnier First Nations people there. But I've been in Vancouver for a long time working in medical genetics research in the lab of Dr. Jan Friedman, so UBC Medical Genetics. And there we work closely with geneticists and genetic counselors in the clinical unit. And their job is to diagnose, guide and support people with a variety of genetic conditions. The clinical unit is the provincial referral centre, so it sees people from all over British Columbia and in fact the Yukon too. So another of the investigators is Rachel Coe. She, in her current life, is a second-year med student. In a previous life, however, she was an award-winning filmmaker.
Wow.
And it's, yeah, no kidding. And it's this expertise that's incredibly valuable in this project to us, and you'll see the film that she's made later on. However, she's doing this as part of the School of the Faculty of Medicine's FLEX program, which is a scholarly research activity that probably you know about, Leah. And that allows you to do some broad-based research, and we're thrilled that she's chosen this project to work with us on. The other people on the team, Nancy Mackler assists with the group facilitating. She's a nurse with a lot of cross-cultural background, so she works with Roberta on all of the focus groups. The other four collaborators are content experts. Bill McKellen is a medical anthropologist who has a particular interest in the genetics of rare diseases. Anna Lehman and Jan Friedman are medical geneticists with genomics expertise, and Professor Susan Law from McGill has interest and expertise in the type of film that we're hoping to produce as the final outcome, or one of the final outcomes, and it's called a touchpoint film. So, sorry. I really want to say thank you so much for inviting us for this project, because although it's a work in progress, we are excited to share where we're at, and we're actually hoping that we can also get some input from everybody here. So what I'd like to do here is give you a brief roadmap for the next hour or so, and Jenny and I will be doing a bit of a tag team, so showing each of our areas of expertise with luck. So we will talk first about the impetus for the project, a First Nations family who came to BC Children's Hospital. They had genomic sequencing, so I'll talk a little bit about genomic sequencing so you can understand how it works, and then the limitations to sequencing, because it's these limitations that have consequences for a number of ethnic groups, including Indigenous Canadians. Then Jenny will talk about some solutions, particularly in the context of the TRC and the frankly atrocious history of genetics research at UBC and elsewhere. And then she'll talk about our project and the approach we're taking, community-based participatory research and respectful collaboration. But I'd like to say that the process and the outcome for this piece of research, I think for Jenny and I, is the process is equally important to the outcome. And finally, we'll welcome a lot of questions and comments, hopefully during the presentation, but also afterwards.
Great.
So
The next slide.
next slide, please. Yeah. So why did we get involved in this project in the first place? It started from a connection by a First Nations family who came into BC Children's Hospital. And here's the family tree that you can hopefully see on the slide here. Healthy parents and their two children who have some specific health problems. And the health problems that they had were the same in each child. And when doctors see that, they think, well, maybe there's something in common that has created the difficulties in these children. And so they suspected that it could be a genetic cause. So they wanted to do some DNA tests. So DNA, this makes sense because DNA is the substance that really controls all our body functioning. So they did many different tests and nothing explained these children's problems. Somebody suggested that we do a new test, genomic sequencing. Next slide, please. So genomic sequencing is a powerful new test, and until recently it was also extraordinarily expensive. But in the last few years the price has literally plummeted, and so it is being used more and more. So the term we use for the sum total of all of the genetic material, all of our DNA in our cells, is the genome. So genomic sequencing is a single test that in one maneuver, in one test, tests all of the genetic material in the body, all the genome. It has a very high diagnostic rate, higher than many previous tests. And of course, with the diagnosis, we hope that that can sometimes lead to changes in management. So that could be something like a more effective drug, or a drug with fewer side effects. Occasionally, it can point to treatment, or very rarely to a cure. Obviously, that would be our goal. So how does genomic sequencing work? Well, we extract DNA, usually from blood, but it can be from other tissues. And cut a long story short, we put it in a machine, and out at the other end comes a sequence, a DNA sequence, which is 3 billion base pairs long. So that's our entire body's instructions for functioning. And by contrast, those of you who might be able to see, there's a little section of DNA, there's a little diagram on the right-hand side of the slide, and that maybe has a dozen or maybe 15 DNA pairs out of the 3 billion, so you can see the scope of what we're looking for. So when we're looking for a genetic condition, we're looking for a change somewhere in those 3 billion DNA pairs. So in medical genetics we call it that change, sometimes it's called a mutation. We prefer to use the word variant. And so that variant could be as small as one single DNA letter, and that change could cause devastating problems for the person involved. So we're looking for maybe something as small as 1 out of 3 billion. So sounds pretty easy, we just need to find it. But finding that 1 out of 3 billion makes looking for a needle in a haystack a pretty easy task. So to find a genetic variant, we actually need to use reference data. So just to give you an idea of what reference data is, almost all medical tests use reference data. Imagine someone with diabetes who pricks their finger many times a day to check their blood sugar level. So they prick their finger, they test it, and they say, oh good, it's 5.7, that's within the normal range, or whatever. So how do they know that that's the normal range? Well, it's because reference data has been created by testing many people who don't have diabetes, so we know what the normal blood sugar level should be. But that's a single test. Blood sugar is one single test. But what we're looking at here is we're looking at 3 billion different bits of data. So sounds like a job for a computer, and it is indeed the case. It's incredibly computationally intense. But the interesting thing about genomics is that it's much harder than that would sound, because the human genome is actually very variable. So apart from identical twins, if you and I meet somebody on the street, we are going to only be about 99.9% the same as each other. Now that sounds, pretty darn similar, but if you think about that remaining 0.1%, what that equates to for the mathematicians in the audience is about 3 million areas of difference that make us fabulously and wonderfully unique. But now you begin to see part of the problem. I'm just going to show you a small graphic so that you can get an idea of what we're looking at. I've put down here a sequence of maybe a couple of dozen letters of DNA. And I've done one for me and I've done one for you. Or maybe you, it doesn't matter who. You can see that the letters are exactly the same in the 2 rows until we get to the green bit. In the green bit, in the top row, there's an A, and in the bottom row, there's a T. And if we were to test thousands of people in the world, we might find, for example, that maybe 20% of the people in the world have an A and maybe 80% have a T. This is a normal variant, and we wouldn't expect it to cause any problems. So the trick is differentiating that normal variability from something that we should be more concerned about. I think, next slide please. So I think maybe you're now beginning to see the problem. There is no such thing as a perfect genome. There's no single perfect string of DNA that we can use as a reference. So instead, what we do is we look at large databases that contain DNA sequences from thousands and thousands of healthy people, and we compare our patients' DNA sequence to those thousands of people in the database. And only by doing this can we be fairly sure whether those areas of DNA variants are just normal variation or something that we need to be concerned about. So going back to a family, that's exactly what we did. So genomic sequencing was done on the two children to examine all their DNA. And a variant was found in both children, the same variant in each child. The trouble was that this variant had never been seen before in either healthy children or people with genetic conditions. So it wasn't in that database with the thousands of people. So what does that mean? So assuming that the sequencing is correct, there are two possible explanations. Either the variants may cause problems, or it's a normal variant, just like that example with the green A and the green T. But if it's a normal variant, then why isn't it in that database that has thousands of people in it? Okay, what's going on here? There we go. Are we on the right slide here?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. So what's the meaning of variation? Have you ever thought about why you look like your sister or why you look like your dad? Well, of course, it's because our DNA is most similar to the people we're most closely related to, because of course we get our DNA from our mums and our dads, right? And so,
Yes.
so siblings look alike because they share DNA, which is that they've got from their parents. And our DNA is similar to our more distant relatives, such as our third or fourth degree cousins or our ancestral groups. But our DNA is most different from people who originated from the other side of the world. And this is the concept, new slide please, of genetic diversity. Here's a visual depiction of genetic diversity. It's one person's concept, and it makes the point that people from, broadly speaking, from a similar area genetically are more similar. So we'll be more likely to be able to correctly interpret any DNA sequencing results, any genomic sequencing variability, if we have access to genomic sequence data from a wide range of people from all over the world. So we want a database with a broad ethnic diversity, and there is one. It's called GNOMAD, interesting name. So GNOMAD is an international database that was developed by a number of researchers, genomic researchers, in a collaboration, and from their website it says it's for the benefit of the wider biomedical community without restrictions on use. So at the moment, GNOMAD has almost 150 anonymized genomic sequences, whole exome or whole genome for the technical people in the audience. And it's anonymized, meaning you can't go from the database to a person and say, oh, that's Jenny's DNA in there, or that's Leah's DNA. We can't do that. I said it was international, and here are some of the countries that have contributed genomic sequences to the database. So Finland, Bulgaria, Taiwan, Germany, and so on and so forth. So what's missing? Let's look at this graphically. Each of these colors is a different, broadly speaking, ancestral group, and you can see the vast majority of the genomes in GNOMAD are from people of European ancestry. You can see there are other broad categories: Latino, African, Ashkenazi Jewish, South Asian, East Asian. And it used to be that, until even a couple of years ago, that these data were highly limited in terms of the number of African genomes and the number of South Asian genomes in the NOMAD database. So what this meant was that it was difficult to interpret their genomic sequencing tests. However, now there's quite a considerable more diversity and a greater number of South Asian and Africans, which means that we'll be more likely to correctly interpret their DNA sequences. But look at that grey bit at the top, that tiny 2% of other. That is where we would expect to see Indigenous people from all over the world. As far as we can tell, there are no, or perhaps very few people from Canadian Indigenous ancestry in this 2%. So this is the problem. We don't have an appropriate reference database for Canada's Indigenous peoples. As far as we know, as I said, there are genomes of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people are virtually absent from these databases. And that creates significant challenges interpreting the DNA variants, just like the family who came to BC Children's Hospital. So the clinical genomic testing that we can offer for Indigenous Canadians is compromised, despite the fact that they make up 6% of the Canadian population. So, next slide please. It looks as if the slides are not quite proportional, but should we not worry about that for the time being?
I think they're okay.
Are they okay?
Yeah.
All right. Jenny's going to talk now about the way we're approaching this issue.
Thank you. So Patricia provided a very very good summary on the issue. I know that when we first met, it can be quite challenging to break it down to terminology that the average person can use. I know that I've seen other slides where it's very technical and very much medical jargon that I think the average person may not understand. So I think she's done a really great job to really provide an explanation that we can identify what it is we're looking at. So when we first started talking about this together at the hospital and the work that we're doing, we began to think, how can we start having a conversation with BC's Indigenous peoples about genomic testing and to raise awareness and understanding of the underrepresentation in the genomic databases, and to start thinking what are the consequences for clinical genomics based on this underrepresentation. So the technical solution that we would think is, well, we just need to add Indigenous genomes to NOMAD. But from a historical perspective, we would then ask from an Indigenous lens, at what cost? Historically, there's a lot of mistrust with the medical system. There's a lot of exploitation that's taking place in the realm of research. So we had to really look at how do we ensure a process of transparency, reciprocity, trust, and approaches that are decolonizing.
That's a giant question.
Yes.
Yes, it is.
So there's a number of considerations that we've put into our conversations with each other as a team. So for many Indigenous scholars, they'll recognize this quote from Linda Smith, who says, "The word research is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary." And when we look more historically at the role of UBC and the work that has been done here, we could argue UBC genetics research is worse. In this example, in the mid-1980s, there was a UBC researcher by the name of Rick Ward who worked with the Nuu-chah-nulth people on a rheumatoid arthritis study. and he went through the process of collecting 883 blood samples with the agreement that this would be specifically for this study. But what ended up happening was it was then used for genetic anthropology and other studies with no consent of the participants. And research papers and documents, there's I think more than a couple hundred articles that were written based on this research up until his death in 2003. And it wasn't until 2004 that the samples were returned to the community and that they were aware of what had taken place. As far as they were concerned, nothing had actually been reported back to them all that time. So you can see the amount of power and control and influence that one person can have, and the amount of distrust that can be, and exploitation that can be done with someone's work in the area of research.
This study was particularly famous, I think, and our people have talked about this for a long time and heard from the New Chalmers. I was wondering if has any repair been done since with regard to this research? Do you know?
I don't know specifically to this research study, but I believe it's in the next, not the next slide, but the next slide after, there's updates of the response from the community to that.
Okay,
Yes.
that would be good to hear about that.
So the next slide, it has a quote from Larry Baird, who's from the Nuu-chah-nulth First Nation, and he said, "Unfortunately, war taught us not to trust researchers, just like the residential schools taught us not to trust the church. He used us like cheap guinea pigs, and that incenses me." So when the community found out what had happened, if you go to the next slide, what their response was to actually create an ethics committee. So that really speaks to the resiliency of the nation. And we included a couple documents here. One was an update from the community where you can really hear in their words the impact that this had on them and the process that they took to move forward from it. And in 2008, they provided a document with protocols and principles for conducting research in the Nuu-chah-nulth context. And it's a really great example that you can read through on what provisions and considerations need to be taken when you're approaching and working together with an Indigenous community. So that's a great resource to have a look at.
It's great because many communities are starting to develop their own ethics and research protocols. I just want to interrupt here because there's been some really good conversation, and I'd like to acknowledge what's happening with our audience here. So I really appreciate some of these responses. So Christy says, "I think that partnership with First Nations will make the conversation easier. Historically, most elders have seen little come of their knowledge." Yes. Sharing and lack of trust in medical or government workers because there's not a process to bring it back, and providing them with equal rights to the information and data. Yes. And Anita says, and I think perhaps we need to think about also not just repairing from one study, the ward studies with the Nuu-chah-nulth, but since it's done within a larger context of the continuing oppression, which is absolutely true. Thank you for that, Anita. All right, I think I just wanted to bring that into the conversation. Oh, and Christy says, I have encountered hurt and resistance in my work when approaching elders, specifically around surveys for funding applications and sustainment. They are hurt that they share over and over that none goes anywhere, and at times it's re-traumatizing for them, especially without any follow-up. And this is a person in Nuu-chah-nulth territory. So it's hard. So you're carrying the history of all that happened before when you're doing research. So how do you acknowledge that history and then convince people that you're actually doing something, anything different, right? I mean, that's the whole thing about research with our communities. And Joe says, We are constantly having things taken out with regard to and respect to Indigenous needs.
Mhm.
You are so right. Thank you all for those for that. Do you have any
Mhm.
comments on that particularly?
Well, I know that a lot of people that are here at UBC now paying a lot of attention and focusing on this particular research project. That really is the bottom line. What Joe was saying is that Indigenous people are just asking to be treated with respect when they're participating in research. That's really what it gets down to.
Yeah,
Mhm.
respect, and they want to know why it's relevant,
Mhm.
and they want to hear back
Yes.
on what the results were. So there needs to be
Mhm.
some kind of community forum and way to give that research back, so there's some reciprocity in some ways,
Mhm.
right?
Yes, and as we go into the specific example of the research study that we're doing, the research project, we'll be able to highlight some of those measures that we've been able to incorporate into this project and what that looks like with this work that we're doing. And the role of a partnership which included ethical considerations that we had to take as Indigenous people participating in this project that we would say is above and beyond all the other ethics boards, like for example the UBC Research Ethics Board. There's steps we had to take for there, but then we also had to think as Indigenous people, what are some of the ethical considerations that we had to think about, and then how would we implement that into the project.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to hearing that. And Joe, just some more comments. I really appreciate that. This is very rich dialogue. Joe, I have found that working in communities and having a local liaison helps. And Katie says, culturally competent trauma-focused lens is priceless. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that, Christy. And I think that is the challenge, because I think lots of researchers, there's a lot of work to do with regard to that. If you don't have any of that knowledge or history, then you just bumble along. And it really is important to be partnered with people that can support you in learning that knowledge, so that you are not re-traumatizing communities in your work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we'll just now go to the next slide, and this is a more recent news article from just this month, and Patricia's going to
Okay.
yeah,
Wow.
Patricia's going to share some of the more recent updates happening in the communities.
Yes, so just very briefly then, this was published in Nature last week, and the Navajo Nation, 175,000 people, it's a huge nation, have had a moratorium on genetic research for the last 15 years. There have been several egregious examples in that area, Arizona and the Navajo Nation. And the Navajo, as I say, they put this moratorium, no genetic research at all for the last 15 years, but they're now reconsidering it because they are building an oncology center for cancer treatment. And what is happening with the world of cancer these days is that personalized healthcare is emerging, such that we can now have DNA-informed treatments. So people will sequence the DNA of the tumor, and that can help to direct the appropriate treatment. Exactly, yeah. So in that context, they now realize that they actually need to revisit this moratorium, and so they're having current discussions right now about having DNA databases and DNA research, allowing it, but having Navajo oversight, and that's key. And Navajo oversight, determining what types of research can be done and who will have access to the data. And I think this goes with what Larry Baird said. Really, it's all a movement towards appropriate use of genetic data. So.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I also know that in the north, Dr. Nadine Caron,
Yes.
who is our co-director for the center, is just working on the blood bank, a First Nations blood bank that is related specifically, I think, to cancer treatment
Yeah.
and others,
That's right,
but
yeah.
really working to she's leading it, but to ensure that there's Indigenous ethics that are forming the gathering of that information for
Which-
people to use.
I was going to say that brings us really to another point. I mean,
Yes.
Nadine is First Nations.
Yes,
and,
right.
And she's in a position of great respect from everybody in Canada.
That's right.
As in the same situation at the Navajo, there are now Navajo geneticists, and so they can actually present things in a way that's respectful and culturally appropriate. So that's another thing that's changing the landscape of research involving Indigenous peoples, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I just wanted to also add, and I don't know if anyone has any comments on this, but I have a relative who has firsthand experience with the genetic sequencing that she's using for her breast cancer. So her
Yeah.
treatment is
Yeah.
based on her DNA and where she's from, and everything is very fine to ensure that she's getting exactly the right treatment based on what her DNA sequence is. Yeah. So I can see how it's saving her life right now. So I can see the benefit of it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great.
Okay, so on the next slide, this is where we began to have conversations on our team. What does an ethical research approach look like with the work that we're doing? So the first point is cultural safety. So having Indigenous leadership and an informed team working together and collaborating together was at the top of the list. Ensuring that it was community-based participatory research, active facilitation of co-learning and to benefit all partners, and develop an understanding of outcomes through an iterative process, which is where we're bringing the information back to the community to verify, have them vet that this is what they said in the process, and then have them confirm that this is their words that they shared with us. So it's not just us interpreting what we think they said, but it's giving them a chance to let us know that is what it is they said. Did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's
Okay.
perfect. That they have, that we've interpreted it the way they meant it to be interpreted.
So
That's the
what
point,
is
right?
what is your research question?
It's a focus group exploring
Okay.
people's opinions
Okay.
and thoughts about this issue of non-representation of Indigenous genomes in these big databases like Nomad. What is the
Okay.
consequences? Does anybody care? What are the issues? How, should it be? Is it something that we should solve?
Right.
How should we solve it? And so it's a very broad focus group series of questions.
And you're hoping
semi-structured
to
and
come
open-ended.
up with some responses ultimately that represent community and give a pathway forward. Is that what you're saying?
What we're looking for is as broad a diversity of opinions about this issue as we can. This is just a tiny
Yes,
exploratory
of course.
project.
Yes.
So we can't possibly represent
Yes.
everybody. I guess we're getting ahead of ourselves here.
Yeah.
but-
Yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
Jenny.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and
Go
we
on.
will go into a bit more detail on what the research project looks like in the next few slides.
Awesome.
I think it jumped forward. Yeah, so the research partnership, so we wanted to ensure participants are invited to choose if and how they want their codes represented and identified once they did participate, and full participation in the dissemination of findings to all partners. And then to answer the question that would come up, we recognize who owns the research data. So Patricia could share a bit more in terms of that process as it relates to UBC, but the additional considerations that we also brought forward.
Yeah, so there are rules and regulations as you can only expect from UBC ethics boards. So the raw data, which in the case of the focus groups would be audio tapes, and then the transcripts that are made from the audio tapes, those are never shared because those are people's audio tapes from, let's say, one focus group, but the other focus groups won't have heard. So it's those data have to be treated as confidential. And so those are locked up, and UBC asks us to keep them locked up, and we keep them for 5 years after the very end of the project at minimum. But the interpretation of the data, that belongs to everybody. And in particular, it belongs to the people who contributed it in the first place. So once we, Jenny will get a little bit more into sort of what our product would be, but we'll have a video and we'll have a report, and those that are made in collaboration through this iterative process will be fully shared and will belong to the people who were participants as much as they belong to us.
Great.
Is that,
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Mhm. So when we came together as a team, we were thinking, what are the project goals? So for many of you who are familiar with the TRC, the calls to action identify to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians' healthcare outcomes. So we really saw that in alignment with the work that we're looking at when we're looking at the underrepresentation of Indigenous people, that this in fact can be a part of that solution in closing the gaps, but then we have to think, well, how do we get there? And the first place is to have a conversation with individuals of Indigenous ancestry. So it's really to raise awareness of the underrepresentation in the genomic database, and to have the voice of the Indigenous perspectives, values, and concerns at the forefront about this. So let's go to the next slide. So the opportunity came up. There was a call for proposal with Genome BC, the Societal Issues Grant. And so we put together a grant application to do this work. And the design process was collaboration and consultation. So with that, we ensured that Indigenous leadership was involved in the project. And we also have an elder, who we mentioned earlier, Elder Roberta, who was a part of rolling out the plan. And before that, we had another elder working with us who we ensured was a part of the grant writing process. So we made sure that there was that connection to the community through this, in addition to the Indigenous representation that was on the team. And when we looked at designing the project, it's exploratory research and community-based participatory research. And for practical reasons, because we had to look at some of the limitations of our resources, the best approach we thought was to do sharing circle focus groups. And then we began collaborating as a team, looking at our different connections, getting ideas from one another on identifying the possible communities that we'd be doing these focus groups with. So we'll just go to the next slide. And so, as I mentioned, did you want to do this one?
That doesn't matter.
Okay.
You want me to?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So this is really the way the each focus group works. Elder Roberta provides an introduction and sets the stage and provides the cultural safety that is essential for a respectful discussion. And then we show an introductory video, which was specifically created for this project by Rachel Coe, that introduces the issues, really talks about genomics. You'll see the video in a minute, so I won't go on about it. And then Nancy Mackler, the facilitator, guides the discussions. What are your opinions about this? What are your thoughts? Are there solutions? Are you worried about security, confidentiality? Who has access? Oversight? Is it needed at all? So that's the way the focus group runs, essentially. Do you want to?
Sure. So we'll just go to the next slide. So this is Rachel Coe, who we mentioned earlier is the second-year medical student, but her background was videography. And so that became a very valuable skill working together with us, because the topics that we were going to look at in the video was genomic sequencing, genomic medicine, genomic interpretation, and a lack of Indigenous representation. So we had to find a way to consider how can we present this to the average person in a meaningful way that's going to use layman's terms and that's going to be culturally relevant and provide an appropriate description. So as a team, there's a few of us that were sitting around thinking about that, and we knew that the best approach would be an analogy. So we brainstormed different analogies that we could use that relates to Indigenous peoples that would be relevant, that they could recognize. And so in the video you're going to see what we came up with, and we will comment a bit more after you watch the video, and we'd be really interested on feedback to the video that we use as an introductory tool in the focus groups.
Great. Okay. So just before we do that, I've got a few more comments. And you know, these are just questions that you've probably heard as you've engaged in these conversations and with communities, and I think there's some really good feedback. Christy says it would be great if there was an opportunity to train or mentor or educate community members to continue or sustain research or any kind of research on First Nations behalf.
Yeah.
It would be huge. Most grandparents would be happy to share, knowing that their families are benefiting from the work and the teachings of their children, like as time goes on. And in this territory we have partnerships between universities, parks, and Canada, so she's a new child in this territory, and First Nations around archaeology, and information is shared, and there's support for land claims, so there's something very mutually beneficial. People can see that, and they've had win-win projects with First Nation students over the years, so that's really great, which I said sounds great, wonderful, beautiful kind of project. Diana asks, though, and this is a very good question, how can researchers, and I think also this is a question for us in our communities, how can researchers guarantee that personal information tests are kept safe, especially when there's a change in staff, which happens a lot in our communities? How will agreements be kept up to date, again, especially with the change of staff and in communities, and especially some of our smaller, low-resource communities? It's a really important question for us to think about as communities decide to engage, but also how do we support communities with that knowledge and those relationships over time? Okay, we don't have answers yet. So, but those are really good questions just to consider. And Diana says there will always be a change in staff. So how do we guarantee that personal information is not misused? There's a definite gap strain in relationships, and how do you propose communicating this research, especially when there is little trust? That is the context. So I guess I'm just, and it's the hope is that with your actions and your behavior and the fact that it's co-led by Jenny, and you are really willing to pay attention to what you hear from community and adjust in the process.
Yeah, and I would say that there's definitely been sort of, even in our process, lessons learned and what we see works and doesn't work, and it always comes down to relationship building when we're approaching communities. So if we have a relationship with a community member, that really helps us to consult with them, what should we do next, and recognizing every community is different. So it's been a very different experience with each community that we've approached to work together with this project.
Yeah, I guess you have to be different, and depending on the context of what's happening and the capacity for the community to be involved.
Yeah,
It's been very challenging.
Exactly.
Great. Thank you for those really great questions. Let's watch this video.
Hello, my name is Jenny Morgan, and I'm from the Gitxsan First Nation and the Director for Indigenous Health at the BC Women's and Children's Hospitals. We work together to promote Indigenous cultural safety and practice while we close the gaps in healthcare that Indigenous peoples receive. We've identified an issue that we're concerned about.
To explain this issue, we need to tell you something about the genome. The genome is the name for all our DNA. It's the instructions that guide how our bodies grow and function, kind of like instructions for making the complex blanket that is each of us. Our genomes are the patterns, materials, and techniques that go into making these blankets. Our genomes get passed down to us from our parents, just like how our parents might teach us a tradition like blanket weaving. Our genomes are most similar to people from our ancestral groups, like how each region of the world has similar blankets made with their own weaving traditions. All of our genomes have normal changes that make us individuals, like how changes in a blanket make it unique. But sometimes a change can lead to a medical problem, like how a change in a blanket could lead to a mistake in a traditional pattern. We now have a test called genomic sequencing that looks at the whole genome all at once, checking the entire blanket for changes. It can diagnose many medical conditions, and sometimes it points to a treatment. To understand the test results, doctors compare them to a database of genomes collected together from many healthy volunteers. If they see a change in the database of healthy people, it's probably a normal change. If they don't see a change in the database, there are two possible reasons. Maybe the change causes a medical problem, or maybe the change is normal in certain ancestral groups, but the database doesn't have many people from those ancestries. Back to our blankets, people in warm climates might make lightweight cotton blankets and dye them bright colors that reflect their environment and culture. People in cold areas might make thick wool blankets with dark colors. If you're comparing a wool blanket to a group of cotton blankets, you might think it's not made properly because it's thick and the colors and patterns are different. But wool blankets are normal in cold climates, and the colors and patterns follow cultural traditions. They are perfect for what those groups need. By comparing the wool blanket to other wool blankets, you can see that its differences are normal variations. This is why it's really important that the database has genomes from healthy people with many different ancestries. If we compare it to genomes from just a few ancestries, we could accidentally think that a change causes problems, when it's actually a normal change. Current databases don't have many genomes from people of Indigenous ancestries, making it difficult to understand the results of Indigenous patients. This isn't just a problem for Indigenous peoples, though. There are many other ancestral groups that aren't well represented in the databases. Here is the story of one family who was affected by this problem.
Hi, my name is Tracy O, and I'm a genetic counselor. A few years ago, we saw an East Indian family whose son had some medical concerns. They were looking for a diagnosis, and so genomic testing was done. We did find a change in the DNA, but it was a change that we hadn't seen before. So we went to the database to see, one, are there individuals with medical problems who had the same change, and or were there healthy individuals, particularly from the same ethnic group, who had that change. But unfortunately, we weren't able to find either. So we had to go to the family and say, we found a change, but we don't know what it means. And that was actually really hard for the family to have that degree of uncertainty. But recently, we were able to go back to the database, and more genomes of East Indian ancestry have been loaded, and we were able to see that, in fact, this change is common in healthy individuals of that ethnic background. So we were able to go back to the family and say, we've got more information now. We see that this change is actually common in healthy individuals of your ethnic background, and so this change is probably not something that your son has to worry about. And that is really great for the family.
We're holding these sharing circles to start a conversation with Indigenous peoples to discuss the issue. We're interested to hear your thoughts, considerations, and concerns. Thank you for sharing with us.
So that's interesting. How was that for everyone? Yes, Katie says, I love the blanket reference. I did too.
Yeah.
I thought it made a lot of sense. It was really lovely. Although I did go to, the smallpox blankets for a second.
Oh,
I
goodness,
did.
Yeah. You see that? I mean, there's something.
There's always something,
There's always
right?
something. Yeah.
But I think it was a beautiful analogy because it made sense to me. Was there any thing else? Did it? Any other thoughts from anyone about the video? Yes, Jacqueline and Anita, blanket reference like that. Is there a place that we can see that video if we wanted to watch it again?
Sure, we can. Well, we
We
can
can
do
put that on
is
the
we have a
website.
link. We can give you that link, and
Okay.
also I think we can put it on the website afterwards. We'll sort it out.
Yeah, okay, so we'll send
Yeah.
that along. I thought it was really great. So if anyone has any other thoughts about that, is there more information that you would want on there? That would be great to kind of give that feedback.
Sure.
So it's just 5 minutes. So we wanted something short. We thought we could do it in 2 to 3 minutes. Obviously, we couldn't.
No.
So it took 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But it just gives everybody the same sort of baseline of information before we start the focus groups. That was its purpose. And not to say that we can't answer or go into more detail with technical information if people want it in the focus groups. But this seems to, we've held 2 so far, and it seems to have worked. It's okay. Yeah,
Great,
people,
awesome.
So if we just go to the next slide, we're kind of midstream now with the focus groups that we're doing. Here you'll see the list that we came up with when we identified which communities we're going to approach. So we've conducted one at the BC Women's Hospital, and our plan was to really engage with pregnant women who are there, and we were hoping for a group of anywhere from roughly 5 to 8 participants, but as you can imagine, patients who are traveling from all over BC coming to the hospital, that their health concerns are really their main priority.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
we did end up with 4 participants in that particular study, but they all actually ended up coming from the community. So we did a broad recruitment, inviting anyone interested to participate. So 4 community members did come, but none of the patients at the hospital were available on the specific dates that we had set. The next one, we went to the downtown east side of Vancouver. The UBC Learning Exchange worked together with us to provide the facility. And Patricia and I actually went down there the day before into the community and were handing out posters. And we kind of guesstimated that if we confirmed about 14 participants, maybe 8 to 10 would come. Usually a lot of people who RSVP for a number of reasons at the last minute can't participate.
Yes.
But in this case,
Get more.
13 of the 14 that came.
Fantastic.
So that was great, a great response that we were well received from the community, but at the same time, it was a bit challenging having such a large focus group.
Yeah.
When the ideal size would have been anywhere upwards of 8. So our next group that we're going to be focusing on is here at UBC, looking at UBC students. So we do have a focus group scheduled on November 1st. And the next community that we're going to be approaching is a local band. So we've been doing a bit of back and forth, and that's where I mentioned communities have a number of priorities happening. So some really don't have the capacity or the time to participate in this type of work right now because there's so many other urgent matters happening. So we really had to take that into consideration. And we also wanted to think, how can we incorporate a rural First Nations community perspective? So we've reached out to about 5 communities so far across BC. to see if they were interested to participate. We've heard back from a couple, so we're just seeing next steps, which would be feasible for the times that we can come and what their availability and capacity is. So that's sort of the overall plan right now for the focus groups for this project. And the next slide will talk a little bit about the analysis part of the work that we'll be doing once these focus groups are complete.
Right. Are you doing any of it by survey, or is it all just in circles?
It's all in circles. Yeah.
Just because you're getting responses here now, so I'm really curious. I mean, I guess that would be, some interesting knowledge that these participants have.
Well, let us know if you're in a community that we can come and visit. Would be
Great. Or if you have any
anything
responses that could be
you'd like
incorporated
to.
into the data.
Yeah. You can contact either one of us. It's, perfect.
So did you want to do this slide?
Oh, okay. So we're in the middle of transcribing our audio recordings, or we actually have transcribed them for the first two focus groups, and we're going to use a thematic analysis to map the themes that emerge, looking for associations between them, noting how frequently they come up, if they're consistent, if they're associated with particular intensity, so the usual sort of qualitative research approach. And then what we're going to do is select quotes to demonstrate people's varying perspectives, and hopefully as diverse a number of perspectives as we can do.
Okay, and then the next slide is the draft of the findings. So there'll be a manuscript to summarize themes and ideas that evolved from all the focus groups, and we'll be also incorporating the video. The video, it's going to be in two parts. It's going to include the introductory video that we just showed, but then we'll add another part to that video which has quotes. So essentially the findings of the different viewpoints of the participants, we'll have that in the video as well. And then we'll invite the participants to participate in the creation of that video in whichever capacity they're comfortable with. So we'll plan that out with the participants. And the draft report, in our recruitment process right now, when we're recruiting participants, we're asking them to come to the first focus group and then letting them know once the findings are summarized, we'll be bringing it back to them to have them vet the process that was accurate to what they had shared in the group. So if we just go to the next slide. Did you want to go in more detail with this one?
If you'd like me to.
Sure.
Yeah, so, excuse me, as Jenny said, the report and the video at this point are in draft format, so then we take it back to the community and they will be participating in making sure that we have interpreted things correctly, and they will be helping to verify and edit our selection of both the text and the audio clips. So what we actually do with each audio clip is people can have a choice. Let's say you have said in the focus group something about, I don't know, confidentiality, and I have brought this theme up and I have quoted you. So then there are a number of different options. We can put that text, well, first of all, you can say, no, that's not what I wanted, I don't want that in there at all. But if you do want it in, then there are a number of options. You can just have it displayed as text without your name, with text with your name. We could have the audio with or without your name, or we could have an actor speaking those lines. So we want people to be comfortable with the product, and so they need to make those decisions as to what and how these are incorporated into the video.
This is interesting because it is different than most research where it's anonymized, right? So that you can, so names aren't, or identifying features are never attached to it. It's when you look for themes. So it's different, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Although it's no different than, say, doing a learning circle where we get to you to sign consent to use of image and this so that we can present it into the community, and it will
Into
be
the
online into
Yeah.
the, you know, forever
Well,
kind of
knows,
thing.
yeah.
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 Mhm.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions here, but maybe you could go into the limitations next.
Sure, we'll go to the next slide. So,
Yeah.
as I mentioned, recruitment may not go as planned, which is what we had happen a few times now with some of the initial groups that we were looking at. We recognize this is a very small study, and it's representing the opinions of a few. So we're making attempts to make it as diverse as possible. With the admission, it's still a small study. When we look at focus groups and sharing circles, they can be unduly influenced or driven by the ideas of few. So even within the sharing circles, as much as we want to provide space for individuals to share, there's still a chance that they could be influenced by what someone else is saying in the group. And then our introductory video and our facilities questions may influence the outcome. So we're really aware of all the number of limitations that may come into play with the approach that we're using. But we do hope this is really just the start to having these conversations with Indigenous communities on, again, going back to what the issue is the underrepresentation of Indigenous people, and if the solution is to stop that, how do we do that?
We have some questions.
Great.
Some really good thoughts and questions, and I'd like to just bring some of them up. I really appreciate some of this very great. So people were commenting on the video and how they like the blanket example and the visual of the parents and kids helping those with different learning styles, which is great. Really helped for everyone. One person said, I thought the Tracy O example was strange because I assume the patient was being tested to answer a health issue, and it seems that they said to the family that there could be something wrong needlessly, right? Because they were going for the genetic,
Well,
right?
yes.
Yes.
So you're faced with a problem there. That's a very good question. So
yeah.
So they see the family. The family has a medical concern. They offer sequencing, and they find something. So that they don't know what it means.
Yeah.
So you could take a paternalistic approach, and not say that you found anything. You could do that.
Right.
And I think perhaps that's what people did a lot in the old days.
Right.
The medical profession is evolving as with everything else, and I think that it used to be that people the doctor might not even tell you had cancer. Oh, they don't need to know. It's best if they don't know.
Right.
So it's a fine line. So in this situation, the decision was made to tell the family that something had been found, but that they didn't know what it meant. But saying, we need to have you back in a year or so because we hope that by then we'll be able to reinterpret what this means. So
Yeah.
does that answer the
Yeah,
the
I
question
think
for
so.
this,
I think so.
participant?
There's the suggestion here, perhaps an example of where they found the missing info that helped later on, or something. You know what I mean? Just if you're wanting to support people's ease, but
Right.
this is also a relevant question because we don't have all the data there
Yeah.
because there's not a lot of Indigenous.
Yes. So the East
Genome
Indian
match.
scenario is
Very
similar. Certainly was very similar, and now there are a lot more East Indian genomes in nomads, so it allows us to interpret
Right.
those genomic sequence variants.
Right. A question, are you bringing to the communities the ongoing concerns that have been expressed? For example, the challenges of pharmacy companies using the data off the genomic and copywriters from the, it's not quite finished, but this sentence.
So Rick, maybe I can just interpret that
Yes,
a little?
that one, I'm sorry, I don't understand
Yeah,
that one.
so obviously, I think the concern is that if data were put into a database, then those data could be used to the benefit of drug companies. I think that's what she's getting at. It is possible, I suppose, but we're deliberately not raising these issues because we want the issues to come from the people
Participating.
who were participating in the focus groups. Yes, exactly. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, partly, and this is, I ask because elders have said to me in the past, we were asked this before, and due to former confidentiality, you may not be aware that they have already provided input to a similar question before.
Maybe if you could contact either one of us afterwards,
Yeah.
that would be something that we could totally talk about
Yes.
offline in more detail. Would that
Yeah.
be appropriate, Jenny?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
My email for sure is at the end of this.
Yeah. And what is the summary of the challenges that people have had? And I think what you're talking about, I think that they want to include some of those challenges as they create, like with all of this data, right? So, because it's really important to have some of the challenges with research on the table so people know
Yes.
that is
Yes.
there. And
So you're thinking then that when we do the touchpoint video,
yeah.
we have the introduction and then we have some of the points that Jenny was raising.
Right, exactly.
To show the fuller picture. Yeah,
That's
an
right.
interesting point.
Ensuring that,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's, yes, there is not enough data there, but at the same time, there are still, having these conversations kind of like sets the groundwork, like, yeah, this is the ground that we're operating
Yeah.
in. So how do we continue to make sure that everything is safe? Okay, and I'm just hoping I'm getting some of this right, and I'm sorry, audience here. I think it would be difficult for traditional Indigenous peoples, as all parts of us are sacred to us. That's a really good point. For some people, it's really challenging. So just to accept that we're not.
So
Yeah.
we have had a range of. I mean, I don't want
Yeah.
to sort of.
Yes.
We have not analysed the focus group
Right.
data, so I can't
Yeah.
really
Yes.
go into detail. But I can say that we have a range, all the way from someone actually outside of the focus group saying, I think we should just accept who we are, and we should not bother with any of this genetic stuff. What will be, will be. So that's the one side. And the other side is someone who said, I would absolutely, if I could give my blood for my DNA, for my genome, and have it put into NOMED right now, I would do it, because maybe my children will benefit, or maybe my neighbours or my friends' children will benefit. So there's a whole range.
Yes.
And things like whether or not we should have a separate genomic database for Indigenous peoples. Of course, if you do that, if you have someone who's living on the other side of the world who may not necessarily know their ancestry, then they would not benefit from that database. So it's only really by putting it into a larger database.
Yeah.
That's the...
And the
It's the
challenge, of
conundrum.
course, too, is that many of us are, through marriage and through the impact of colonization,
Absolutely.
have many genetic
different ancestries that we
ancestries,
don't
right?
know.
That we don't
We,
know.
None of us know.
No,
None of
right?
us know, right?
Yeah, it's
It's
true.
not just Indigenous people.
Yeah.
None of us know what we are.
Yeah.
We just are what we are.
That's right, yeah. So,
Yeah.
for sure.
So we'll just jump to the last few slides very
That
quickly.
would be great. And any other questions, please just type them in, because we'll have to close off in just a minute.
So we just wanted to acknowledge the funder, who is Genome BC, who provided us this grant. So just quickly mentioning, we started in July, so we are anticipating to complete the project in 2018 in June, and then shortly thereafter begin bringing it back to the community, the findings and results and the outcomes that we mentioned. And as we also mention that one of the groups is going to be here at UBC, so we have the date set for Wednesday, November 1st. So if there are any interested UBC students wanting to participate, they can.
Please RSVP. There's my email, Patricia
Students
Birch
or
at
adults,
ubc.ca.
right? So
You
have
not
to be
all
19
students
plus.
out here, right? This is also, many of our audience members are out
Yeah.
in communities, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yes, so sorry for those of you who are out in
Yeah.
the communities, but maybe if there's a community connection out there, then
Right.
you could let us know
Yeah.
and we could come to you if that would work. But if there's anybody who would like to participate, please RSVP to me. You've got the email address there. I'm going to be going out around campus in a few minutes doing some postering.
Okay.
So you see some posters with this
Right.
this look to them around
Okay.
campus, and please
Yes.
contact me. We're looking for 8 to 10 people
great,
in total.
awesome. And that's it?
Yes,
Thank you very
that's
much.
everything.
I want to thank
Yeah.
you very much. This has been really great. And there's one question that we have here that was really interesting, and or a couple of questions that maybe we have, and you might not be able to answer them, but let's just see. And if not, I will share this with stream, and
Good.
we can perhaps get you to answer them. So yes, what about the role of health insurance companies and them denying a person coverage based on a particular gene?
That's a fabulous question.
And that is an incredible thing
thank
that people
heavens.
are very fearful of that, right?
In March this year, the government passed the genetic non-discrimination bill. I can't remember the name of the bill. Bill number
Yes.
106 or something.
Yes, yes.
I will, if anybody wants a link to that, again contact me. And that is really huge. It's
Yeah.
massive.
It is.
Um,
And especially with big data and everything out there, and people are so afraid
Yes,
of that kind of thing.
and as they should be.
Yeah. And Christy, you answer or ask a really good question too, and the question is, will this benefit genetic effects based on trauma and the changes in epigenetics? That's another interesting
that's
area
a
of
very
research
interesting.
too,
Epigenetics is not something that would be
covered in
collected.
DNA sequencing,
Well,
right?
yeah, it wouldn't be collected in this particular database. It is something that can be measured, it can be quantified, but that's not something that is part of this of NOMAD or
Not
or
part of
this
NOMAD,
project.
right.
This, yeah, or this,
But I
this
guess
project. We're
once
not
you
addressing
do, if you decide that you want to give your genetic code for this database, you might be giving it permission to be used for other databases
No.
too. No,
No.
you're not.
No.
Wow, that's awesome. That's really good. So you're only using it just for that.
People who are collecting it.
Yes, have on obligation, they have to just.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
You
there
can
we
go to the NOMAD site. You can either just Google NOMAD, or you can, I think it's NOMAD at the Broad Institute, something like that.
That's really
Yeah.
good because
Yeah.
that would make people feel a lot safer, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah, to know what it is. Thank you,
Thank you.
lovely ladies, for being here. Hajka, everyone. I hope you have a beautiful day, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.